Hey, Michael Schnitzer was just in the studio. We had a great conversation. He shared today with us his passion for history. We're usually talking all Stanley Martin, but not today. You get another side of Michael Schnitzer. Enjoy. All right, so welcome, Michael. I got Michael Schnitzer here sitting down with us today, and we're going to chat about something totally different. We're normally talking about Stanley Martin Custom Home stuff when we get together, but today we want to learn more about you. So welcome, Michael.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
Thanks, John.
So why don't you start out and give us a little, tell us a little bit about your family history and how you grew up and things like that, and let's learn a little more about you.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I think I was thinking about this, John, because I know you and I had spoken before. You said, come over, let's talk and whatever. And I was like, kind of what would I want my kids to know, perhaps when I'm not here?
Right.
And just trying to give a little bit of family history I thought may be kind of interesting. So, kind of reflecting on this, so my grandfather came over to this country. I think he was 13, 14 years old. His parents put him on a boat from Europe by himself.
Wow.
And came to this country.
Amazing.
So, I think myself, like, now this was late 1890s.
Right.
Could you do it in this day and age? I wouldn't put my kids on a boat by themselves and say, see you later. Right. I mean, it's just crazy.
Right.
So he comes to this country and, he has to start making a living and starts to sell scrap metal. Mm-hmm. And was selling scrap metal. Then he became friendly with this family. So I grew up in Baltimore, Baltimore County.
So now, did your grandfather come into Baltimore? Is that where he came in? Or
interestingly, I don't really know.
Okay,
I think
fair enough.
But I know he came here.
Yeah,
that's all I know. So, but he became friendly with this family called the Blausteins, and they were relatively wealthy. They owned the Baltimore Orioles at one time. There used to be this old gas station, not gas station, but Crown Oil Company, right? Crown Oil used to be everywhere. They owned Crown Oil. And they helped my grandfather out, and he started to then sell scrap metal from the back of a horse and buggy, right? So that's the way they did it in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Then he started selling used tires.
Right.
Then eventually he bought or opened up a tire business in Baltimore. Mm-hmm. Then he eventually started manufacturing tires.
Wow.
Then he eventually owned, I remember as a child, because I used to go to work with my father because this became a family business. Mm-hmm. There was like 6 or 7 city blocks that my grandfather owned. And at the same time, he's bringing family members over from Europe. So he is, what you truly define as a self-made man. And
that's
just
really
think
amazing.
Of the struggle that he had to go through.
Yeah.
However, perhaps the opposite was he knew of the struggle that he had left in Europe.
Right.
And so perhaps from his perspective, this was, yes, a struggle, but not anywhere near what he would have had to have gone through, right?
Right. So he probably would have never owned 6 or 7 blocks in anywhere in Europe, right?
Not only that, he would have been persecuted. It would just been a whole nother can of worms.
Exactly.
So I remember the family story. So in WW2, what does any immigrant want to do?
Right.
Sign up and enlist, right? So he goes down multiple times to try to enlist because he wants to fight for his new country. Mm-hmm. And every time he's turned down because, of course, he has this manufacturing facility making tires and blah, blah, and the government said he was an essential business. So he was, I don't know if he was pissed, but I know he was disappointed.
Yeah.
And he started looking for other things to do. And back in the day, and what I'm going to say now, it's not really prevalent anymore, but there used to be this Masonic lodge, right? Mm-hmm. And people used to, the Freemasons, and I guess back in the day it was huge. Mm-hmm. And my grandfather joined he wanted to figure out ways to give back, so he started feeding the poor in Baltimore every week. He eventually, and again, I don't have a good reference point for this, but evidently in the Freemason Society, the highest level is this like 33rd degree, right? So like presidents of the United States, and it takes something special to get to that level. My grandfather did, and I don't know if it was because he couldn't give back to his country in the war, so he gave back in a different way. But I just look at it, I'm thinking to myself, man, that is truly a self-made man, right? Nothing, came from nothing, and was very successful. And then I kind of flash forward, my father and my uncle took over the business. At one time, I think they had maybe 12 or 15 stores around the Baltimore County suburbs, plus the headquarters downtown. And I used to go with my father to work probably twice a month, go downtown and just do stuff, right? I was just
So how old were you when you did that, do you think?
I may have been 6 or 7.
Right.
And maybe I'd go down once every couple months, and then in my teens, I'd go down and do stuff. And, my father worked sun up to sundown, so I knew what it took to be successful, right? Perseverance, hard work, determination. I mean, I saw it. I lived it every day, not as an owner of a business, but as the son of an owner of a business. And it was interesting. My father downtown had a lot of people. They had this huge warehouse. There was this one gentleman. His name was Reverend Tommy Jenkins, and Reverend Jenkins was, among other things, the foreman, and everybody respected him. Nicest guy, but even as a kid, I knew, like, you walk around the whether it was the retail store or back in the manufacturing facility, just he had a lot of respect. And I remember, so I must have been, 7, 6, whatever, when tragically MLK was killed, and all the inner cities lit up, right? There was fires, there was riots, and my grandfather had really been kind to Reverend Jenkins, and they helped him build a new church, and in terms of giving money and whatever. And during the riots, Reverend Jenkins' entire church kind of surrounded the family business in Baltimore to make sure it wasn't destroyed, right?
Wow.
So it's interesting how you almost you get what you give, right? It's so kind of what comes around goes around in a good way,
right?
And so I kind of always looked at that and said, it's again, perseverance, be kind, do good things will happen to people who do good things. And it really had an effect on me. I remember, and it really gets into people's, it's almost like the human condition, and just it's that visceral thing that you can't really quantify. I look at my wife's side of the family. So my father-in-law remembers in WW2 a postman, mailman, coming to the door, delivering a death notice to his mother. So my wife's grandfather died on his 3rd mission over the Pacific in the Battle of the Rabaul, right? And just like, think about it today, like a mailman bringing you a death certificate.
Right.
And, that had a huge impact on my father-in-law when he was a little kid. Again, human condition, what's in your DNA, kind of how are you made up, and what do you think, and what's your passion? He said, I want to go into the Navy, right? So he goes to the Naval Academy a year early, eventually becomes, I think, either the youngest or one of the youngest people to ever make admiral, eventually becoming, I could spend probably 10 shows talking about what my father-in-law did. So I'm not going to get into
Yeah.
all the details,
Of course.
but eventually gets to, 4-star admiral, had the position that, and I'm a big history fan, that Chester Nimitz, who was Admiral Nimitz, who in WW2, it was Nimitz and MacArthur in the Pacific, same position. I remember visiting my father-in-law on the island of Oahu, and he was sat in the same desk that was Nimitz's desk. So it's just just history, man.
Wow.
It's just so cool, right? So it's just, so I was thinking about just how people react to either adversity or just people today really can't you almost have to live in the time to be able to even truly understand what people think. Right. It's just, it's almost impossible.
It is. Yeah.
I just, anyway, so, and I don't know what it is or what it was, and this was well before I ever met my wife, but and this is really odd. So my passion was I loved history. And I almost think that even more than loving history was loving to read about major influential historical figures and kind of what made them tick.
Right.
And it's just, I don't know how I'm blending these two together, but I remember, and let me give you so people are talented and people will persevere and work hard, right? So, kind of at a high level, you need a little bit of both, right? And sometimes if you have a little less talent, you may have to work harder, right?
That's me.
Right. It's, I think it's everybody. It's in their nature, if they're successful, to sometimes have to compensate, but you have to be you got to have some God-given talent to be able to utilize that to propel yourself forward. So I remember as a kid, I loved math, hated to read. I remember having fights with my parents. I didn't want to read. I'd sit down and do math. And I also, and in an odd way, always wanted to be outside, loved the game of lacrosse. I carried a stick with me probably for 17 or 18 years and literally slept with the thing, right? It was like my passion. But like if I was home and I was just kind of putzing around, my mother was an artist, and this has so I must have had some inclination, but I used to like sketch and, sketch houses. It was just like weird, It's like, why am I even doing this? It's like, so I had no idea, right?
Yeah.
But it's just something that I was drawn to. I know I didn't have my mother's talent, right? She would just paint and sketch people. Like, I just didn't have that talent. But I always thought of myself as a little bit of a paradox, right? Like, why would you be this, someone who kind of likes math and sits around sketches, but really all he wants to do is be outside and play lacrosse.
Right.
And so there's a lot going on. Hated to read, and yet probably when I was maybe 15 or 16, started to read. I was not a great reader, and the first book I read that I truly remember was a book by a gentleman by the name of Schur, wrote this book called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, right? So it was I don't know, maybe 1,000 pages, right? And I worked through that book, and I just loved it, man. I loved the personal drama and the conflict. And Schur at the time was a reporter, and he was there in Germany during the rise of the Nazi regime, and even once Hitler had taken power, whenever. So it's just a fascinating book. And that started me on my lifelong quest to read, right? Now, remember, not a great reader, but I probably in the last 25 years have read every night.
John Jorgensen here, and if you're considering building a new home in Northern Virginia or Montgomery County, Maryland, Reach out to us through our website, webuildonyourlot.com. That's webuildonyourlot.com. We have pricing and floor plans online, lots of great process information, and contact us through the website so we can get you started on the path to your very own Stanley Martin Custom Home.
Every night of my life, and I only read history, and I love to read most especially about people and what makes people tick, and not just the average person, just great leaders. You know, what is it about them and the human condition and how fallible people are, right?
Absolutely.
So it was. You know, so I've kind of run the gamut in terms of the Roman Empire. There's this author, and this was a crazy read. This author Gibbons, who wrote about the basically the fall of the Roman Empire. To my favorite person of all time happens to be Winston Churchill. And way back in the day, there was this 3-volume set by William Manchester called The Last Lion, and I read those 3 books, and that hooked me into Churchill. And I always thought, you know, so this is from the perspective of my grandfather and struggle, and if you read through Churchill, I mean, the guy was, I mean, when he was first born and in his childhood, I mean, everybody wrote him off, right? He was kind of you know, he wasn't athletic, he was a little feeble. His father wanted nothing to do with him. And like all Brits, he goes to boarding school, right? You read through his letters, and he'd be writing to his parents. By the way, his mother was an American. I think it was her name, Jean Jerome, who married his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, who was in Parliament. But his father absolutely had nothing to do with Churchill, and like he begged his father to come visit him. His father like literally gave a speech across from where Churchill was at boarding school, wouldn't even walk across the street to see him. I mean, just kind of that. That's
awful.
You know, just kind of like, so, and you look at this guy and you look, and not to bore you with the details, but you look at what he did in Great Britain. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, in my mind, he single-handedly held back the Germans, right? Because at the time, FDR was fighting isolationism, right? So the U.S. wasn't coming in, because if you can't bring your country with you, you're not going anywhere, right? And so not to get too much into history, but I just find it so fascinating. So I'll just talk about it a little bit. So Chamberlain is removed from Parliament. Churchill assumes the position, and there's all kinds of stories I could tell you about that. But it's, you know, I used to just, even as a kid, I remember, and maybe just because, you know, my father grew up as a child in World War II, and so, you know, I was a product of, you know, the end of the World War II and the beginning of, you know, the Cold War. But, you know, what is in a person like Churchill's DNA and his ability to write the most inspiring words, right? So, like, he takes office, and, you know, within a couple days, he goes on I guess it was the BBC back then, and he goes, "All I have to offer is blood, tears, and sweat," something like that, right? It's like, you know, he's not sugarcoating it. He's telling exactly how it is, right? Or those famous lines where he said, you know, if the British Empire shall last for 1,000 years, people will say, this is our finest hour, right? I mean, he's just, I don't know, just some of his words are so powerful. And just think how they had to take a country who in World War I lost about 900 and some thousand people, right? The U.S. doesn't even understand World War One because we only really fought in World War One for about 6 months.
Right.
And we lost maybe 100,000 people.
Right.
I mean, it's a lot of people in a short time, but the U.S. has no monuments of World War One. We don't really get it. We didn't lose those kind of numbers. And so he had to bring the country with him. And there was a lot of people who were, I don't want to call them pacifists, but they didn't have an appetite to fight another war.
Right.
So it's and Churchill knew he couldn't win it. He was just biding time, waiting for the Americans to enter, which, as terrible as it was or is at the time, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Hitler, within 2 days, in a reactionary moment, declares war on the United States. Boom.
Yeah.
Churchill gets his wish. Right?
Yep.
I mean, it's like it's just unbelievable.
It is.
So, but just think, can you imagine that guy just sitting home and, they'll take yourself and say, okay, do I have that kind of DNA to be able to withstand that kind of pressure? It's just, it's mind-numbing, right?
So what do you think? So what do all of these characters that you've studied, what do you think the common thread is? Or is there a group of common threads that make them exceptional?
Yeah. I think to a person, they've come from some kind of family, I'm going to call it trauma, but some kind of event that shaped them, right? And so maybe that was the spark, and they had it in their core to be able to rise. Because, I know myself, I couldn't rise to a level of taking an entire country and moving it forward, and the perils that must have gone on.
Right.
I mean, John, look at yourself. So you married a French woman, right?
Right.
So think about France, right?
Yes.
So the U.S., who we have really no perspective of, if you look at World War One and World War Two, which really World War Two was World War One Part Two, right? It was really not World War II.
World War Part 1 and 2. Yeah,
really. So France loses 2x the number of people in Great Britain. So let's say they lose 2 million people, right? And those are the 2 million fighting men who were, at the time it was mostly a man's type of war in terms of being in the trenches and fighting. And what did the Americans think? The French, they can't fight battles. They're kind of wimps. But if you look back on it, France, in terms of the European continent, was the most dominant power in Europe, right? Through Napoleon and whatever. And yet, they lose, let's say, 2 million people. And granted, Hitler comes in and with the Blitz just absolutely decimates, right? France is fighting last era's war with the Maginot Line, whatever. So the Germans just come right in. France just didn't have it in them.
Right.
They didn't have the horsepower to end the public sentiment, to withstand that at that time, the Nazi aggression. So it's just, it's crazy. And then, and you look at, in terms of just the human condition, how fallible people are, right? And it seems, if you go to that leadership level, right? So the English had what's called the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, right? And Hitler, through his wonderful, and I'm saying this tongue-in-cheek, advice of Hermann Goering, says, we can knock the Brits out. We'll just bomb them. I'm using the word because it wasn't used back then, carpet bomb them, right? Like just bomb the crap out of London and all their facilities and armaments and whatever. Didn't work. Made them stronger, right? You look at the Allies and what they did to, and perhaps rightly so, they leveled the city of Dresden, right? I mean, completely rubble, Did that really change the Germans? No. Look at what the U.S. did in Japan, right? So there was a guy by the name of Curtis LeMay. Back in the time, there's no Air Force, so it was the Army Air Corps. LeMay, I mean, there was all kinds of things in terms of altitude bombing and low altitude. But we used napalm back then, and we just firebomb Japan. I mean, the amount of people that the Japanese lost based on quote unquote traditional bombing. So forget atomic bombing, right? Because that's a game changer. I don't even know if the world exists,
Right.
at least in our concept, if that really happens to in today's society. But none of that bombing had any effect on the people. In fact, it probably strengthened their resolve, right? And then so you look at just the fallibility of leaders. What is it? So I guess where I'm getting at is, so you have this as the backdrop, and then I remember growing up, the fear was communism and communist expansion, right? That was it. In fact, there was a famous person, probably my famous person, who coined the phrase the Iron Curtain, right? So Churchill did a speech in Missouri, and that's where he coined the term, the Iron Curtain has descended upon us, right? But the U.S. was worried in French Indochina about what they called back then the domino effect. Like, where do we draw the line, right? And stop the spread of communism. And so there was multiple presidents on both sides of the aisle. Had certainly Nixon did this in a big way, but so did Johnson, whatever. What did they start doing? Right? This is like the fallibility and the inability for leaders to really understand. We started carpet bombing Vietnam. And 12 or 15 years ago, we just went through this.
Right.
And had no effect.
Right.
In fact, I don't think the U.S. lost one battle. I may be wrong, whether it's Ted or whatever. We never lost one battle in Vietnam. We lost the war.
Right.
Never lost a battle, right? And we tried to carpet bomb them. Didn't work. It just strengthened the resolve of the North Vietnamese. But what was the right answer, right? I mean, you had communist aggression. I think we can all agree that communism, for the most part, I don't want to get into any political things, but communism is the antithesis, or not the antithesis, is the other side of is polar opposite to capitalism, regardless of, right? But back in the day, people knew you had Mao. Mao probably murdered 40 or 60 million people in the name of quote unquote socialism. Right? There was no free will in China.
Right.
You did what you were told to do, and if you were a subversive, you were killed. Look at Stalin, right? Another huge communist power. I don't know how many he killed. 10 million. 12. You really don't know because it's a closed society.
Right.
But what we do know is it's not a good thing, and we had to stop it. And how the U.S. viewed it as like an existential threat, right? So you have this one thing is like, where do you draw the line? You have this other thing is like, you can't win a battle, and so there's no. So that's kind of the, just that human struggle,
right,
if you will.
Yeah.
And the thing that I just eat that stuff up.
I see that. Yeah.
Reading about it. Yeah. I mean, it's just crazy. So I just figured I'd give you a little perspective and kind of what I do and what I think about kind of outside of work.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit too much for the average person, but I'd love reading about it.
Yeah.
I try to use that and think about that in my life. So.
Like what you're hearing on the Go With John show, please share it with your friends. They can sign up at gowithjohn.com.
So I grew up, we were talking, all I did was play lacrosse. I, from an early age, I wanted to play lacrosse in college. And I was faster than lightning. I had good stick work, and stick work meaning stick. But I worked at that game sun up to sundown, right? That was my dream. And my dream eventually came true. So I go to college, and I'm going through college. And
So where'd you go to college?
At University of Maryland.
Okay.
So go to college, going for an engineering degree, right? Guy doesn't love to read, doesn't want to go into English. Not that I can't read, it just wasn't my passion at the time. But I love math, right? So I go into engineering, not because really I knew I wanted to be in engineering. I knew I liked math, and I had a friend who was a year ahead of me, and he was an engineer. I'm like, okay, well, I'll go into engineering, right? So, I mean, that's how I became an engineer, and then, or graduated with an engineering degree. And I remember after my first couple of years, I'm like, oh, well, the engineering program's like 144 credits to graduate. Normal BS degrees like 120. Right. I'm like, oh, man. This just isn't sitting right with me because I am not going to school for more than 4 years. So all of a sudden, this almost not monolithic, but the sole passion about playing lacrosse, it totally evaporated. And all I wanted to do is now graduate
on time,
get to the next level. So I dropped lacrosse. I stopped playing. I could care less about it anymore.
So what year was that in school? Was that second year?
No, like third year.
Okay.
And made sure I graduated on time. So I graduated. I went to work at Westinghouse in radar systems. And I'm looking around and say, you know what? I hate this. There's no way I can stay working with these. I'd see a guy, he's got like a pocket protector, and he's working with doing a math class. Like, oh my God, man, this is absolutely devastating.
So how long did you do that?
I lasted, I think, 3 years. I was going back to school, getting a master's, and I was like, I have to hit the eject. This is not for me. So I had luckily, my father, we had a business and had money. And I said to my father, I think I'm going to go into building. I don't even know why. Maybe it was when I was sketching as a little kid. I don't know. A close friend of mine and we built a tree fort in a tree. So I have no idea. So I find an architect in the Baltimore area, had a really good name. And I said, let's start a building business and I'll have my father back me. So we started building houses. And obviously I have an engineering degree, so I understand
putting the parts and pieces together.
But I don't know building from schmilding, right? I mean, it's just not, how do you schedule? How do you do a takeoff? Blah, blah. So after, I don't know, maybe the third or fourth house, the architect, who was really leading the charge, right? I was more of like going to the job sites and whatever, just wasn't really a business person, right? So I finished up the two projects that we had. I didn't want to leave my father's money just sitting at risk. And said, you know what? If I'm going to go into this, I better really understand the business from the ground up, right? So I, quote unquote, took a step back, moved down into the DC metro area, worked for a large builder, and started from I don't say the ground up, but, as a superintendent, learning all facets of the business, whether it's construction or land development or purchase, whatever, and kind of ascended through all positions. And, it's interesting, but.
So which builder was that?
Oh, back in the day, it was the Milton Company.
Okay.
Milton Schneiderman really had a large home building business. So this would have been back in the 80s.
Okay.
And long story short, and thinking back to my father or my grandfather, I used to wake up 4:30 in the morning. So you know what? Get up before the sun's up, work late, right? Put in, I think I worked 7 days a week, maybe 6 days in the field, in the office, blah, blah, blah. And so I had this great determination, singular determination to succeed. And look at the dumb luck, right? So I got this engineering degree, practiced engineering, hated it.
Right.
But I can utilize some of the courses in my manufacturing business. I used to love to sketch. Right? It's like, what in the heck, right? Yeah. Who would have thought that? On my mother's side, my mother, artist, that I really had this talent to sketch houses. I viscerally know as I'm sketching what's going to look good and what's not, and seeing things in 3 space. So I had this kind of like this one-off thing as a kid that kind of comes back to me in spades, if you will,
right?
Based on how this little niche that I found myself in.
Yeah.
And I always my father-in-law used to define this. So luck is where preparation meets opportunity, right?
Well, you and I talk about that actually quite a bit.
I'm just completely lucky.
Yeah.
Because I was prepared and I had the opportunity.
Yeah.
And, and I look at myself now and I say, I'm a complete enigma, right? I don't even understand what makes me tick, right? So I know I'm an introvert at my core, right? And how do you define that? If someone were to say to me or John say to you, hey, let's go out and party every night, I would literally break down. Yeah. Like literally, the proverbial wheels would fall off my bus. I would be in an emotional wreck, right?
Yeah.
It's just not me.
Right.
But yet I go to work and I love being an extrovert. What is that?
Yeah.
I can't figure it out.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, how do you change, did I just change a horse into a zebra? Or did I make a horse just run faster? I'm almost thinking it's a horse to a zebra. Right? I mean, think about it, right? Because total extrovert, total introvert.
Yeah.
So what am I?
Yeah.
I love analysis, and John, you know this. I love to, and it's probably the engineering side, get in the weeds, which is great as a manufacturer, right? Because what we manufacture, there's hundreds of thousands of parts and pieces, and unless you're diligent about detail, you're not going to be successful.
Right.
Right? But I love to sketch houses.
Yeah.
So I feel this need that's more of creative with sketching. I fill this kind of more of analytical side with the detail. I'm this extrovert who's an introvert. So what am I, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like I should be like on some game show because nobody would ever be able to figure me out because I can't figure myself out.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is you intimately understand the detail, and I think you enjoy educating the consumer about what is being created.
Maybe, maybe there's maybe you hit something in that. Maybe I'm an introvert that gets so excited, I turn into an extrovert.
Exactly.
But why don't? And I'm saying this rhetorically. Why don't the wheels fall off my bus?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Whereas if I was home in a social scene, don't put me in a party every night.
Yeah.
I will absolutely melt down.
Yeah. Well, there's no defined topic, and there's no rules at a party. At a party, you got to walk in and wing it, right? So
yeah, but I walk in like in here, I walked in and winged it.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah, not really. You got notes.
I woke up this morning, wrote a couple notes, and made sure okay, what am I even going to talk about?
Yeah, exactly.
But so it's almost like I'm a dichotomy, an enigma, and I have yet to be able to figure myself out. I cannot figure myself out.
Well, I'll say it's really amazing to watch you work, and I mean that sincerely. The the gift that you have, and it's a gift, and I tell people all the time, I tell our customers all the time what a gift it is. The way you hear what the customers say and how you convert that into a sketch and then eventually into a home is amazing. When our buyers say things, I hear the same thing you're hearing, but you run it through your processor of all of the data that you have, all the historical data you have from having designed and built, and you said go from two-space to two-dimensional to three-dimensional, and somebody can say, I want certain things in a home, and you kind of already know what they want. It's really amazing how it translates. And
well, there's luck again.
Yeah,
really the definition, right? So I'm prepared because I've seen pretty much everything.
Yeah.
And the opportunity, the customer walks in our proverbial door,
right? And
I just listen to them. I'm like, oh yeah, I get it. I can see that. And then I start just
right,
winging it. But so now I was thinking from a business side, everybody has strengths and everybody has weaknesses, right? So I was thinking, okay, what are my two greatest opportunities, right? So one you already hit on, which is I have to live in the details in order to make sure the business is successful at the ground level.
Right.
But boy, I better get from the ground level to 1,000 to 10,000 to a mile high, using kind of the airplane added term.
Yeah.
Because I can't lead a company in the weeds.
Right.
So what are the objectives? And then have the team help figure out the details. And don't spoon feed them the details, right?
Right.
Give them objective and listen to what they have to say. So that's always an internal struggle with me that I think over the years I've gotten better and better, where I've got to live in the details so that we get the house right. I'd better live at a mile high, especially when it comes to where are we driving the company, what are key metrics, things of that nature, right? So you gotta, that's one thing. And then the other thing is that I found if my nature is to tack as a sailboat, right? So sailboat, I'm not a sailor, wants to find the wind, pick that wind and tack left, then tack right. Well, think about what that does to your organization, right? It creates complete chaos.
Correct.
It is probably the worst thing that a leader can do, and I've recognized that for years and years. And I know to this day, unless a building's on fire, there is nothing so important that I need to respond to that can't wait a day or two. So there may be something going on that kind of gets my hair to stand up. Right. I may write an email. I'll never send it. Right. And I'll go back a day or two later and like, good Lord, I would really, maybe this was 30 years ago, send that email? Yeah. It makes no sense. And so perspective, just time and letting yourself kind of calm down and really understand. Yeah. And seek to understand. Yes. John, one of the words you love to use. Yeah. I found that to be, what I found to be one of my greatest weaknesses, I hope, interesting to ask the team, has turned into a strength because I think about that every day. Yeah. And I don't let that interfere because I realize the consequences are absolutely terrible. Right. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think a lot of that comes with age and maturity as well and experience, because I find myself, the older I get, the more experience I get, the more I trust the folks that are around me, to do the right thing and not have to micromanage as much as I did when I was younger. So it's... Or just even respond. Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly. And I'll tell you that... Boy, I tell you, probably you and me both. I go back 20 or 30 years ago, some of the things that came out of my mouth and went out of my office. Right. They didn't need to go. You're exactly right. And it's hard to contain yourself, especially when you're younger and don't have the the perspective of time.
Well, I think when I was younger, I lived in a position of believing that if I didn't firmly go after all of the problems around me, people would take advantage of me. They would see me as weak. So I probably overdid it when I was younger, out of self protection to maintain control in my business world. You know, so but it is hard. And then I also think the older you get and the more successful you get, the more people around you trust you, and you don't have to fight so hard to have your vision fulfilled. Is another part of it.
That's a point very well taken.
Yeah.
Right? Because you have nothing, not that you don't have something to prove.
Right.
But you're not trying to voice yourself so loudly.
Exactly.
Exactly. But you know, you hit on something that as in terms of running a business, you have to let people fail.
Yes.
And you have to build a framework around that, because if people aren't failing, what does that mean in business? It means they're not growing. And if they're not growing, they're not learning. And so whether you're setting a framework of a financial amount, right? How many thousands of dollars per widget, right? Or maybe how many cents per widget,
right, am I willing
to lose to allow my people to learn? And I think I've gotten very good at that, right? Like so you want to learn from your mistakes and not what's the word? Belittle somebody, right? Because all you're trying to do, this is their learning curve, right?
Right.
So if you belittle them, they'll stop learning, because they won't want to take risks.
Yeah.
But you got to know what's the box that they can take risks in, right? I mean, that is huge.
Yeah.
I would say, and I know you and I talk about this, runway, right? So how much runway does a person have?
Yeah.
And how do you think about a person's runway in terms of a new hire versus a person who has less runway? You know, maybe it's X divided by 2, like half the runway, right?
Right.
And knowing, depending on the market conditions, you know, in our market, you know, the unemployment rate is typically low because we government agencies and whatever.
Yeah.
And you know, how do you make the right hire? Is it, and I'm not saying that there's a right or wrong, but you know, everything being equal, you would rather train someone who had less knowledge,
right,
who had huge runway, because that's going to pay dividends, than very little training on someone who's out of runway.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And
so try to define your runway analogy a little better. So a longer runway means what? They have more
bandwidth.
Gotcha.
So more.
Okay.
So this is really more capacity to learn.
Right. So my airplane analogy, I'm thinking a longer runway, they need more effort to get the plane off the ground. So I'm with you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that, yeah. But I'm looking at runway as, have they run out of runway where they, regardless, they're never going to take off?
Exactly. Okay. I got you.
So, you know, that is huge. Giving the people the space to make mistakes, to grow, is huge.
Yeah.
To, for me, not to tack, right? And for me to come out of the weeds and try to, for a portion of the day, spend time at a mile high, or maybe it's 10,000 feet high.
Yeah.
You know, and that's along with perseverance, because I think perseverance, determination, almost usurps everything else, right? So
Absolutely.
you got to have some intellect, because without that, you're done.
Right.
But I would take a person who has runway and maybe the runway is only X long,
Yeah.
but has so much perseverance. It's the ability to overcome, right? Going back to history and looking at great leaders. If you look at overcoming things, I always think about this. We all have bad days, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes in this business, we could have a bad week. Yeah. Or a bad, maybe not month, but
Well, we had 2007, 2008. I'd say that was a bad year.
That was a bad year, right? So we get these periods which really, it sucks.
It does, yeah.
And then you say, okay, let me get some perspective.
Yeah.
I wasn't in the trenches in World War I.
Right.
I didn't have the anguish of a George Marshall or Dwight Eisenhower or wherever you want to go with these great leaders, FDR, wherever you want to go, right? So why am I even, and the word isn't complaining because I'm not complaining,
right?
But how is this in perspective
a struggle
anywhere close to being a struggle?
Right.
Yet I think it's a struggle, but when I start looking at it in the long arc of time and history, I'm like, this is nothing.
Right, that's true.
I know I'm going to come out the other end.
That's true.
And I'm going to put a minuscule effort, relatively speaking, to get to that other end.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I think makes me tick and get, when you get these, like, the peaks and valleys of business, it says, you know what? Yeah, it's bad. This is nothing.
Yeah.
I'm still living. I got it found, right? It's
right.
And John, like in terms of struggle, so my wife had I was just thinking about this. So she had, my kids were, I think my son at the time may have been 2. She had this tumor that wrapped her spine from her bottom to her neck.
Yes.
So, and there were, initially times we didn't think she was going to live.
Right.
She went through about 10 surgeries over 12 years. This is when my kids were young through their teenage years. And there were times where I'm like, okay, I'm not even sure we're going to make it through this, right?
Right. Yeah.
Dwelling back to...
Right.
Okay.
And I went through something similar with my mom.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
So you get it.
Yeah.
So I'm taking care of the kids by myself because my wife was in and out of hospitals. She was living with pain.
Right.
And it was terrible.
Right.
And I still working my self to, not to death, but just in terms of the term, working hard.
Yeah.
Taking care of the kids. Going down, visit my wife at the hospital for months on end, blah, blah, blah. And, I look back on it and I say, it was terrible, but I wasn't in the trenches.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I wasn't the Bataan Death March, right? It wasn't, I wasn't in a concentration camp. Whatever.
Right.
So it's all perspective. And I think
is.
that's what makes me get through things is just, just kind of the reflecting back on history and great people and what they suffered. It's an
interesting perspective. It really is.
Yeah, I think
really
about it all
is.
the time. So it's kind of it's interesting.
Yeah.
To think about that. So that's kind of long and short. Just a little kid growing up in Baltimore, ended up down in the D.C. metro area. I would say relatively successful. Would I do things differently? Maybe. How would I do it differently? I have no idea.
Yeah.
Kind of just the twists and turns of life and taking advantage of things that come at you.
Yeah. Good deal. So, Mike, that was a lot of really interesting information. Enjoyed listening to all that. So, in closing, what do you want for your kids, right? So you've studied history, you're living in the present, you've been through, just like I have, we've been through 9/11, we've been through the financial crash of 07, 08, we've been through COVID. What do you see in the world, and what do you want for your kids? And
yeah, it's especially in the time we live in. So what irks me is people that really don't understand history. So they make these statements and they really have no idea right? So they'll opine about something from the 1800s or whatever. Oh my God, how did that happen, right? But they didn't live in that time period. So, first I would say my kids become knowledgeable and form your own opinions, but form them based on facts and understanding the arc of time. Enjoy your kids while they're young. The one great thing my wife says, you have got to make time for the kids, right? Because I was always working. And so probably a little more so with my son, but, I coached lacrosse and I coached football. I had no idea how I found the time. But I knew it was important, and if I didn't, my father never did that. My father could not do it, right? Could not do it just because it was just at that, he was running a family business that was very large at the time. And, I guess the way he and my uncle managed was just different. So try to find time for your family. You live a short life, and there are going to be struggles, and you're going to have to work through it. We all want our kids not to go through struggles, but, here, I'll just give you an interesting thing. I was thinking about this a while back. So my grandfather comes from nothing, right? My father, this is in the early 50s, turned 16. What does my grandfather do? Buys him a car, right? I mean, who gets a new car? And probably my uncle and my aunt got the same thing. As soon as they turned 16 in the early 50s, right? It's just, maybe even the 40s, who knows? So then I grow up. Does my father buy me a car when I'm 16? No. Right? So product, right? So when my son and daughter turned 16, what did I do? Oh, I didn't get a car when I'm 16. I bought them a car when they were 16 because I felt bad knowing what my father put me through. So it kind of says I wonder what my kids will really be like. I've got grandkids now. And I see my son had my granddaughter before my daughter had her child. And I said, my son's going to be probably a little bit more stern than I am. And so it's just kind of interesting, but everybody's got to go through it at their own course, and hopefully they'll be successful, and just hopefully they'll listen to some of the things. I don't know if they'll ever listen to this podcast, but if they do, hopefully they'll take some of the things that I say to heart.
I predict they will both listen to this.
Yes, I hope so. I hope so. So I was thinking, how would I end this? And since I'm such a history guy and love Churchill, I thought maybe one of his inspiring phrases, and he was such a wordsmith, he said, "This is not the end. This is not the beginning of the end, but this is the end of the beginning." I just think of that, how he put those words together.
Right? It's amazing.
Or he said, here's the last one. So the RAF was trying to hold off the Luftwaffe during the Blitz and pre-Blitz. And he goes something like, never in the course of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. So he's talking about the RAF. It's just his, just the short little pithy things that for some reason for me just stuck with me.
Right.
So that's what I'm going to leave your audience with.
Fantastic. And yours.
Exactly.
Thank you, Michael, for coming in.
Great. Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Go With John show. Please subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice and keep up with our latest episodes and what's going on with the show at gowithjohn.com. That's gowithjohn.com.